Alright, so it's the morning after I first set up that experimental thermal battery, which is just made out of trash and not properly insulated at all. Like, it's not done right. The dirt that I chose is just basically sandy topsoil from my yard, which was full of water and all kinds of other crap. And I used just a stovetop burner from like a typical stove, kind of old school, the coiled burner that you can just set things directly onto. Um, and those, my ammeter is on the fritz, so I wasn't really able to measure its resistance, but they're typically in the range of 25 to 30 ohms. So I'm assuming it's around 27 ohms, which sort of fits what I'm seeing. So I actually did the math correctly, and I realized what my mistake was earlier. So if I have one of these and I'm supplying it with 12 volts, the resulting wattage is about little over 5 watts. So if that's set up um, in a thermal battery like like Roger described, which is much better designed than than mine. It's basically like a 5-gallon bucket, 20-liter bucket, and the walls are very, very well insulated, and the sand is selected carefully. I think using my setup with the 27 ohm ish heating element, it's reasonable that you could reach temperatures right around maybe 170 Fahrenheit, 77 C, somewhere in that ballpark. What I did is I just looked at what he was claiming his did, and then scaled it, and then kind of backed off a little bit just to make it reasonable. So I feel like that's probably attainable. And looking at what my rig did, how it's looking this morning, that's probably about right. It's still the way mine is. It has like a sort of a flat bed of sand with the heating element just in the middle of it. So really, only the middle of it is actually getting warm, and it's still just warm to the touch. So it's maybe 45 C. It's not that hot. But there's a lot of problems with it. Basically, as a proof of concept, I feel like it was a success because it did not drain my lead acid battery system overnight at all. Like, that system didn't even feel it, so that's good. So I could definitely scale up more and get more heat out of it, but it did consistently produce heat. It is working. So as far as that goes, I'm happy. And then I was playing around, and I'm like, okay, so what if I put more of them in parallel? Because I have several of these. I have at least 3 of them. So if I put 2 in parallel, then we're looking at more like 10 watts. And that could potentially reach temperatures up to like 275 Fahrenheit. And what the fuck? God damn it. So that's like low baking temperatures. You can actually like cook shit with that. And then I was like fucking around with it, and I was like, okay, so I think what I want, I don't even remember my line of reasoning here. I'm just like taking notes as I'm like thinking about shit. So I was targeting an 8 ohm resistor with basically this. So I was like, well, all right. So either 3 or 4 of them. So let's go with 4. What does that give us? So 4 gives us, what is this, 20 watts. And this one could potentially reach temperatures around 400 Fahrenheit, which is quite nice for cooking. And with 3, we're looking at around 16 watts, which might, again, in Roger's setup, not in mine. And for me to establish something like Roger's setup would cost me money. So that's basically what's going on here. Where we're at, all the shit I have is just free. So the fact that I'm producing a warm bed of sand for free with extraordinarily little effort, I'm happy with that. I'm happy with that at this point. So yeah, with 3 burners in parallel, I'm probably going to be closer to 340, 350 Fahrenheit, something like that. So then I kind of broke it out, and then I also looked at 24 volt systems, which is what Roger did. He put 2 solar panels in tandem, so you get 24. He was claiming 26. I'm not sure why. Maybe. Well, yeah, I guess that does make sense, because in reality, in direct sunlight, they each do produce around 13 volts. Yeah, that makes sense. That's probably why he was saying that. But even in sort of indirect sunlight, you're getting a solid 11.5 or 12 off of them. So I prefer to kind of err on the low end, just so you can kind of get a more accurate, like over the course of the day, the angle's not going to be right, you know, shit like that. So yeah, with the 12 volts, so there's the breakout, basically 1, 2, 3, or 4 burners, and the wattage for 1, 2, 3, and 4 burners. And then basically I said, like, the top 3 settings are actually useful for baking, and that bottom one is good for a dehydrator. So these are all useful. These can all be potentially very useful. Yeah, so these are the numbers where I backed off, right? So up here, like, this is what I calculated directly, right? 340. So back off of that, and I figured like 20, 25 degrees Fahrenheit off of each of those, which is around 10 degrees Celsius. Back off on that much on all of them is probably fairly reasonable. So turn the 400 to 375, and most recipes that call for using an oven are going to be right in that range, right around 350, 375. So that's a perfectly usable value right there. And then with 24 volt, it's kind of lazy with these bottom ones. I just took this and doubled it, or yeah, I took this and doubled it, which is here. I took, for this one, I took this and doubled it, which is here. So yeah, and then I sort of calculated these ones. Here we're getting quite hot. Here we're actually, these top 2 settings, you can actually start pyrolyzing stuff. This is at the very low end of where you can pyrolyze things. 3 burners with a 24 volt. But 4 burners with 24 volts can definitely pyrolyze shit. So, for sure. And then kind of an outline of Roger's machine. So these are the figures. So he had a 16 ohm with 24. Well, he was claiming 26. I backed it down to 24 just because of, you know, angle of the sun and shade and clouds and all kinds of shit. Like 24 as a more conservative estimate. And that gives us around 1.5 amps. And if you have 1.5 amps, that's where I was getting the roughly, in my head, the 40 watts earlier in the last video. So yeah, that's why I don't trust mental math, because it's easy to get shit mixed up. So I was multiplying numbers that I had figured out correctly. They were just not numbers that should have been related to each other when I put them together. So yeah, about 36 watts. So looking at, you know, doubling this to 40 watts, that makes sense. That makes sense that you're going to be getting those kinds of things. And the, let's see, we're looking at 7 ohms. I don't know, there's some things about this, I might have fucked it up, but whatever. He's looking at 20 liters of quartz sand. It's probably not completely full. It's probably more like 15 or something. And he's claiming that this yields temperatures up to 350 C, and overnight it cools down to 250. So this is unpowered overnight, right? Because it's purely just run directly off the solar panels. So it's only getting up to this over the course of the day because of sunshine. So yeah, so 250 C should actually be an ideal temperature for pyrolysis. So yeah, these kinds of figures here, yeah, we should be quite good with that. So this is like a little over 350 C. This, I think, was actually pretty close to 250, if I recall correctly. The nice thing about the large, as the numbers get large, generally the Fahrenheit number is about twice the Celsius number, because that error of like 32 degrees disappears. So once you're in this territory, you can pretty much just like double your Celsius number, and you're like have a pretty solid estimate of your Fahrenheit number. So if we double 350, that gives us 700, and then just add 30 to it. Yeah, you're right about there. So yeah. That's about right. That's about right. Because this was like a 40 watt system. This is a 36 watt system. So those should be really close to each other. So I turned it into, instead of looking at ohms, I turned it into looking at watts, because the watts, I feel like, makes more sense here, because it sort of tells you the energy that you're working with instead of resistance, which is much more abstract. So the fact that this ended up being a 7 ohm system doesn't really mean anything relative to this 16 ohm. What matters is that it is 20 watts. And then when we double the voltage, right, because voltage times amperage gives you wattage. So if we double the voltage, you have the same amperage, so it's going to just be 40, so it's going to give you this guy. And notice I was conservative, because I didn't just straight up double this. So I think these are reasonably attainable numbers if you set up your insulation fairly nicely, and you don't use like a flat spread out bed, but you use more like a column, like in a bucket. That would probably be better. So my current setup is far from optimal, but as far as a proof of concept, I think it's promising. It's worth tinkering with some more.